When my son told me he needed help, I thought he meant a few $100s. Maybe a loan to cover their bills or fix the car again. I was used to that, the quiet, hesitant calls late at night, his voice softer than it used to be when he was little. But that evening, as he stood in my kitchen with his arms crossed and his wife sitting beside him with her phone in hand, I realized this wasn't one of those moments. He didn't come for help. He came with an expectation. "Mom," he said, his voice almost rehearsed, "Sophie has some financial trouble. It's about $300,000 and we really need your help to clear it before things get worse." I remember the way he said it, calm, casual, as if he were asking for a recipe or a cup of sugar. And in that instant, something deep inside me froze. I stared at him, trying to find my little boy in that tall man who now looked at me like I was a solution, not a mother. I'd spent 62 years of my life building quiet strength. My husband, Robert, had passed away 8 years earlier, leaving me with our small home, his pension, and memories that felt both sweet and heavy. We were never rich, but we were happy. Every dollar was earned, every meal shared with laughter. Robert always said, "Wealth means peace, not money." I didn't truly understand what that meant until that day, the day my peace was tested. Sophie didn't speak for the first few minutes. She just sat there, her manicured fingers tracing the edge of her phone case, not meeting my eyes. Finally, she said softly, "We know it's a lot to ask, but it's urgent. It's for our future. Their future. My savings." I felt my hands trembling, not from age, but from the sting of realization. They weren't asking me out of desperation, they were demanding out of entitlement. "I can't," I whispered. "You can," my son said quickly, almost cutting me off. "Dad left you money, right? You've barely touched it. We just need a portion. You'd still have enough to live comfortably." That word, comfortably, sank into me like a knife. He was talking about my husband's pension, the savings we'd built from years of long days and quiet nights. That was supposed to be my safety, my dignity in old age. But to him, it was a resource to be mined. I remember feeling the room shrink. The smell of coffee gone cold, the hum of the refrigerator, the way the sunlight hit the chipped edge of the kitchen counter, everything suddenly looked different. Distant. He didn't even ask how I was doing. He didn't notice my swollen knees or the arthritis that made it hard to sleep some nights. He only noticed what I could give. And that's when I realized something that broke me quietly. My love had turned into an obligation in his eyes. But I didn't cry. Not then. I smiled, the way mothers do when they're trying to hide the cracks. "Let me think about it," I said. "Give me a few days." He nodded, relieved. Sophie looked satisfied. They both left, holding hands as if they'd just solved something. But they had no idea what they'd started. That night, I sat in the silence of my living room. Robert's photograph watched me from the mantel, his kind eyes, his small smile. I whispered to him, "Did we do something wrong? Did we raise him to think love means taking?" Clock ticked quietly. I remembered all the sacrifices, working double shifts, skipping vacations, saving every penny so Daniel could go to college. And I thought about the phone calls that grew less frequent, the visits that grew shorter after he married Sophie. It wasn't just about money. It was about respect, or the loss of it. I spent that night awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every memory I had of Daniel as a child. His laughter in the garden. The first time he called me Mama. The way he'd fall asleep on my lap after watching cartoons. Somewhere along the line, that little boy disappeared. By morning, I made my decision. Not out of anger, but out of quiet clarity. I called him and said I'd think about how to help, just to keep peace a little longer. But inside, I had already decided what kind of mother I refused to be. Because love isn't giving until you're empty. Love, I realized, is knowing when to stop being someone's backup plan. What they didn't know was, Robert had left me more than just money. He'd left me a plan. The next morning, I tried to go about my usual routine. I made my tea, fed the stray cat that came by my porch every day, and watered the small geranium Robert had planted before he passed. I told myself not to think about Daniel's visit, not to let it darken my peace. But it clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every sound in the house seemed louder, the creak of the floorboards, the ticking of the clock, even the faint rustle of the curtains in the breeze. It all reminded me of how quiet my life had become. Once this house echoed with voices, with warmth. Now it was filled only with memories and the faint echo of disappointment. By noon, I decided to go through my old financial papers, partly to distract myself, partly to remind myself of what Robert had always told me. Don't ever sign anything out of guilt, Mary. People's desperation isn't your responsibility. His voice, even after 8 years, still felt like a warm hand on my shoulder. I opened the cedar chest in our bedroom, the one that still smelled faintly of his aftershave and paper. Inside were folders of bills, certificates, and one small envelope labeled in Robert's handwriting, "For Mary when she needs strength." I froze. I had seen this envelope before, but I'd never opened it. The day after his funeral, I placed it back in the chest because I couldn't bear to read it. Now, sitting on the edge of the bed, I slowly peeled it open. Inside was a short letter written in his gentle cursive. "My dear Mary, if you're reading this, it means you're facing something that tests your heart. I know how deeply you love, how quickly you forgive. But don't ever let that become your weakness. Remember, peace isn't found in giving everything away, it's in keeping what truly matters. You've earned the right to rest, to live without fear. There's a folder beneath this letter. Look at it only if you must. Something I kept for your security. Use it wisely. Robert." I set the letter down, trembling. Beneath it lay a thick blue folder. Inside were papers, bonds, certificates, and documents from an investment I didn't even know he'd made. My breath caught when I realized what I was holding. It wasn't just his pension. Robert had quietly saved over the years, investing in something that had grown far more than I ever knew. And suddenly I understood why Daniel's tone had been so confident. He knew. My hands tightened around the folder. Did he know about this money? Had Sophie told him? That afternoon, I called my old friend Clara. She was the only person I trusted enough to confide in. We'd met in nursing school decades ago before I quit to raise Daniel. Her voice, soft and seasoned with wisdom, steadied me. "Mary," she said after I told her everything, "you've been generous your whole life. But kindness without boundaries turns into permission. Don't let them use your guilt as a key to your peace." Her words lingered long after we hung up. That evening, Daniel called again. His voice sounded tense this time, rehearsed again. "Mom, did you look into it? Sophie's debt is piling interest. We need to make a decision soon. That word burned. "Yes, Daniel," I said quietly. "I've looked into it. But before we go further, I want to know, how did Sophie end up with that kind of debt?" He hesitated. "It's complicated. Some business investment. A partner backed out." I could hear Sophie in the background whispering something. Then Daniel sighed, impatient. "Mom, this isn't about blame. It's about family helping each other." "No," I said softly. "It's about choices. And whose mistakes I'm expected to clean up." Silence. Then, in a low voice that didn't sound like my son anymore, he said, "I thought you'd care more about us." That was the moment something inside me quietly broke. After he hung up, I sat at the table for a long time, staring at the phone. I wasn't angry, not yet. Just hollow. Like the years of love and sacrifice had dissolved into something weightless. Later that night, I went for a walk in the garden. The wind was cool, carrying the scent of lilac and soil. I looked up at the stars, the same stars Robert and I used to count from the porch, and whispered, "What would you do, Robert? How do you forgive someone who sees your love as currency?" I didn't hear an answer, of course. But the stillness around me felt like one. When I returned inside, I opened the blue folder again and tucked it deep into a locked drawer. And then I wrote something on a small notepad, just one sentence that felt like both a decision and a goodbye. If love becomes a transaction, it's no longer love. I placed the note beside Robert's photo and turned off the lights. But that night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing Daniel's face, his impatient expression, the way Sophie's eyes darted around like she was guarding a secret. And somewhere between wakefulness and dream, a thought struck me, one I couldn't ignore. What if the debt wasn't hers at all? The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling from my cup of tea. The house was still, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, that quiet, lonely kind of stillness that makes you hear your own thoughts too clearly. I couldn't stop replaying Daniel's words in my head. It's about family helping each other. The way he said it, like love was a loan that demanded repayment, tore through me. For 30 years, I had been his anchor. I'd stayed up through his fevers, worked double shifts when Robert lost his job, and sold my jewelry when he needed tuition money. I had believed every sacrifice was worth it because he was my son, the best of us. But sitting there in that silent kitchen, I realized how quietly things had shifted. Somewhere between his marriage and my widowhood, I had stopped being a mother and become a resource. That realization hurt in a way that didn't make me cry, it just emptied me. Around noon, I decided to go into town. I needed groceries, but truthfully, I just needed to see other faces, people who smiled without expecting anything. Clerk at the market, a young woman named Marlene, greeted me with her usual warmth. "Mrs. Harding, you're out early today." I smiled faintly. "Just needed a few things." She rang up my items, bread, milk, tea, and handed me the bag. But as I turned to leave, I caught sight of the community bulletin board near the door. There, pinned between flyers for piano lessons and a lost cat, was a small notice. Debt relief counseling, private, confidential. Call now. I hesitated. My first instinct was to look away, to tell myself it didn't concern me. But something made me take a photo of it with my phone. Maybe I just wanted to understand the world Daniel and Sophie had fallen into, the kind of world where people owed hundreds of thousands of dollars and called it complicated. When I got home, I sat at Robert's old desk and dialed the number. A polite voice answered, a woman who introduced herself as Ms. Lewis. "I'm calling about a debt matter," I said. My voice trembled slightly, so I studied it. "It's for someone else, but I need to understand how these things work." She explained everything in calm detail, how business loans could be taken out jointly, how signatures mattered more than promises, how sometimes debts were disguised under one person's name to protect another's reputation. That last part made my stomach twist. To protect someone's reputation? I asked carefully. "Yes," she said. "Often a spouse will take on a loan for the other, especially if they have better credit or less scrutiny. Happens more often than you think." After we hung up, I sat there for a long while, staring at nothing. My tea had gone cold. What if Sophie wasn't the debtor? What if Daniel was? It would explain everything. His defensiveness, his tone, the way he'd avoided details. He wasn't trying to save her, he was trying to save himself. The air in the house felt different then. Heavier, sharper, as if it too had learned something it couldn't unlearn. That evening, I received a text from Sophie. I hadn't expected one. She rarely contacted me directly. "Sophie, hi Mom. I hope you're okay. Daniel's stressed, but we'll figure things out. Please don't worry too much. He just wants what's best for everyone." I stared at the message. It was polite, even kind, but there was something underneath it, something too smooth. I didn't reply. Instead, I pulled out Robert's folder again, read through the investment papers, and checked the current balances online. I hadn't realized how secure he'd made me. Between the interest and the property value, I was more than stable. I could live quietly for the rest of my days without needing anyone. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm, not happy but steady. That night, as I made myself a simple dinner, the wind outside picked up. The trees rustled against the window panes, and I remembered something Robert used to say whenever storms rolled in. "Don't fight the wind, Mary." Just close your windows and let it pass. Tomorrow you'll still be standing. I whispered those words aloud. They sounded different now, not just comforting but instructive. Maybe it was time to stop trying to hold everyone together. Maybe it was time to let the wind do what it would. A few days later, Daniel showed up again. No call, no warning, just the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. I watched from the window as he stepped out, pacing before knocking. His posture looked tense, almost desperate. When I opened the door, he went straight into his plea. "Mom, we're running out of time. Collectors are getting aggressive. If we don't pay soon—" "Daniel," I interrupted softly, "is the debt yours?" He froze. His eyes flicked away. "Don't lie to me," I said, my tone still calm. "You forget I raised you. I can hear it in your voice." After a long silence, he whispered, "It's complicated." I sighed. "That's not an answer." He rubbed his face, his voice cracking. "It started as hers. But when her business went under, I co-signed. I thought it would recover. I didn't want you to worry." I felt something deep inside me shift, a mix of sadness, pity, and something colder. "You didn't want me to worry," I said. "But you wanted me to pay." He looked at me then, his eyes wet with frustration. "You don't understand, Mom. I did it for us, for a future. You and Dad never had the kind of opportunities we—" I stopped him with a quiet shake of my head. "Don't rewrite history, Daniel. We didn't have much, but we had enough. And we never lied to each other to get more." His shoulders slumped. "So that's it? You're just going to sit on all that money while we drown?" "All that money?" I repeated. "Is that what you think this is about?" He didn't answer. He just turned away, muttering something under his breath as he left. The sound of the door closing echoed like thunder in that small house. After he drove off, I walked to Robert's photograph on the mantel. His smile looked gentler that night, almost knowing. "I think you were right," I whispered. "Sometimes love means closing the door." That night, I started making a list. Not a financial one, a personal one. I listed the places I wanted to see before I was too old to travel. The friends I'd lost touch with. The garden I'd always wanted to visit in Oregon. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of my freedom. The quiet moment when I stopped waiting for apologies and started preparing for my own escape. 'Cause the truth was no longer a question. I knew whose debt it was. And now I also knew what I had to do. I was going to leave. But this time I wouldn't say goodbye. Strange how silence can become a companion when your heart has finally made a decision. The morning after Daniel left, the house didn't feel as heavy anymore. It was still quiet, still old, but the silence had changed. It wasn't loneliness now, it was space. Space to breathe, to think, to remember who I was before everyone started asking me for pieces of myself. I sat on the porch with my tea, watching the early light fall across the garden. The rosebush I had planted years ago was still blooming, stubbornly pushing out new life through the dry soil. I thought maybe that's me too, still standing even when no one bothers to water me. For most of that morning, I wandered through the house as if seeing it for the first time. Every room carried echoes of a life that used to feel fuller. The faded wallpaper in the hallway, the photo of Daniel on his graduation day, Robert's hat still hanging by the door. I touched it gently, remembering the weight of it in my hands the day after he died. I had promised him I'd be strong. But I never imagined strength would look like this, not like walking away, not like letting go. That afternoon, I opened the drawer where I'd locked Robert's blue folder. Something inside me urged me to look again, to see if there was something I'd missed. When I lifted out the documents, an envelope slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. It was smaller, sealed with a piece of yellowed tape and labeled in his handwriting, "For when the world forgets your worth." I held it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single page, folded neatly. "Mary, if you ever feel small, remember this: the life you built is yours. The house, the savings, the peace, they were never meant to be gifts for anyone else. You spent your years taking care of everyone. Promise me you'll spend the rest taking care of yourself. R. That letter didn't make me cry. Instead, it made me smile, a soft, trembling smile that came from a place deeper than grief. It was as if he'd known this moment would come, and he'd written those words just to remind me that love isn't about how much you give, it's about how much you honor yourself. I spent the next few days in quiet reflection. I cooked small meals, cleaned the house, and sorted through old boxes, not because I had to, but because I wanted to decide what was worth keeping. Each item felt like a decision about my life. What to take with me, what to leave behind. When I opened the old photo album, I found a picture of Daniel when he was 7, smiling, missing 2 front teeth, holding up a drawing he'd made of our family. Beneath it, in childish scrawl, he had written, "Mom is the best person in the world." For a long time, I stared at that little note. I wondered where that boy had gone, the one who used to cry when I left for work, who used to sit on my lap and say he'd build me a big house one day so I'd never have to work again. Maybe that's what motherhood is, loving someone so deeply that even when they forget you, you can't forget them. But that love had to change now. It had to become something quieter, something that didn't hurt. That evening, I went for a walk through the neighborhood. The air smelled of rain and cut grass. I passed by the house of a couple I'd known for years, Tom and Evelyn. They were sitting on their porch swing, laughing over something small. Evelyn waved me over. "Mary, you look lighter," she said with a smile. "What's your secret?" I almost laughed. Maybe I just stopped trying to fix what wasn't mine to fix. She nodded knowingly. That's the hardest kind of peace to find. We talked for a while about gardens, recipes, little things. But when I walked home under the dimming sky, I realized how long it had been since I'd had a conversation that wasn't filled with guilt or expectation. It felt human again. When I reached home, I stood in the doorway and looked around. The walls, the photos, the furniture, they all told the story of my life. But suddenly, I knew this chapter was ending. I didn't feel sadness this time, just clarity. I took out a small suitcase from the closet and placed it on the bed. It was the same one I'd used when Robert and I took our first road trip decades ago. I smiled at the memory, the way he insisted on packing too many snacks, the way we got lost and laughed about it. This time, I wasn't running away. I was simply choosing to live. But as I began to fold my clothes neatly into the suitcase, something caught my eye, a brown envelope taped beneath the drawer of the nightstand. It must have been there for years, hidden in plain sight. I carefully peeled it off and opened it. Inside were documents, legal ones. A will. Robert's will. But it wasn't the copy I'd already seen years ago. This one was handwritten, personal, and notarized separately. And as I began to read, my heart pounded. In the event that my wife, Mary Harding, is ever pressured, coerced, or manipulated into financial decisions by any relative, including our son, this document shall serve as her legal protection. All assets, including the house and investments, are solely under her name. No claim or debt of any relative shall have legal standing against her estate. I couldn't breathe for a moment. He had known. He had somehow seen this coming. I sank onto the edge of the bed, clutching that paper like it was oxygen. Robert hadn't just left me security, he'd left me armor. He had seen the way life can turn good people cruel when money becomes involved. And he'd made sure I'd never be at their mercy. That realization changed everything. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about what that paper represented, love that protected even from beyond the grave. I folded it gently and tucked it into my purse. I knew then what I had to do next. I wasn't just going to leave, I was going to make sure Daniel understood what his choices had cost him. Not through anger, not through punishment, but through silence. 'Cause sometimes silence speaks louder than any confrontation ever could. That night, as I turned off the lights, I whispered to Robert's photograph, "You always did know how to save me, didn't you?" And for the first time in years, I slept deeply. Not out of exhaustion, but out of certainty. What I didn't know was that the next morning would bring something unexpected, a knock on the door that would change everything again. I didn't sleep that night. The ceiling above me looked unfamiliar, a stranger's ceiling in a house that suddenly felt like someone else's dream. The hum of the refrigerator from the next room, the faint ticking of the clock, all sounds that used to mean home, now echoed with an emptiness I couldn't escape. I thought about every year I'd spent working, every extra shift, every late night I told myself was for the family. For him. And now all of that was just gone. Not because of money, but because of the way they made me feel small for not giving more. The next morning, I woke up to silence. No calls. No texts. Not even from Michael. He used to send me good morning messages every day, even as an adult. Just small things, a photo of his coffee, a joke, a heart. Now nothing. I sat at the kitchen table, holding my phone, waiting. 10 minutes passed. Then 30. By noon, I realized I was holding my breath for a son who might never call again. That afternoon, I went for a drive. It was cold, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones no matter how tight you wrap your coat. I didn't have a destination in mind, I just needed to move to feel like I was still alive somewhere. I ended up outside the old library where I used to take Michael every Saturday when he was little. He'd run his fingers along the spines of books like they were treasures. Back then, he'd tell me, "One day, Mom, I'm going to be rich. I'll buy you a big house so you never have to work again." I smiled at the memory and then I cried. 'Cause the truth was, he had become successful. Just not in the way I expected. He'd learned how to take, not give. He'd learned how to demand, not appreciate. And somehow I'd let him. Later that week, a letter arrived in my mailbox. No return address. But I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was from Michael. My hands trembled as I tore it open. "Mom." I don't know what to say. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was just desperate. When Emma told me about the debt, I panicked. You were always the one who could fix things. I thought maybe you could fix this too. I'm sorry if I made you feel like I was using you. I just didn't know what else to do. I love you, Mom. Please call me. I stared at the words for a long time. Some part of me wanted to believe him, to call him right then and there and pretend everything could go back to the way it was. But another part of me couldn't, 'cause even in his apology there was something missing. Accountability. Understanding. Gratitude. He said he loved me, but he didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask where I'd gone or how I was surviving. He only said he was desperate. And that's when I realized desperation isn't love. It's need. And I was tired of being needed only when it was convenient. A week later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, then answered. "Mom." It was Emma. Her voice was shaking. I didn't know what else to do. "Michael won't talk to me. He's been angry, drinking a lot. I thought maybe you could help." I closed my eyes. Even now, even after everything, they still turned to me to fix what they broke. "Emma," I said softly, "I can't help him this time." There was silence on the other end. Then a quiet sob. "I understand," she whispered. "I'm sorry for how we treated you." I didn't reply. I just listened to the sound of her crying, and for the first time I didn't rush to comfort her. Because I had finally learned, not every cry is mine to answer. Days turned into weeks. And slowly I started to rebuild my life, one quiet morning at a time. I found a small community center in town that offered art classes. I hadn't painted in years, but something about holding a brush again felt healing. Colors became my language when words failed. I painted sunsets that reminded me of forgiveness and oceans that whispered freedom. And one afternoon, when I stood back to look at my canvas, I realized I was painting my own story. A woman who gave too much. And finally, one day stopped. But peace doesn't come without ghosts. One evening, while walking home, I saw a car parked at the end of the street. A familiar one. Michael's. He stepped out, his face pale under the streetlight. He looked thinner, older, broken in a way that startled me. "Mom," he said, his voice trembling. "Can we talk?" For a moment, I couldn't breathe. All those months of distance, of silence, of trying to heal, suddenly collided with the boy I once held in my arms. I nodded slowly. We sat on the curb, side by side, neither of us speaking for a long time. Finally, he said, "You were right. I lost everything." Emma left. The debt collectors took the house. I didn't know where else to go. There it was again, the familiar rhythm of loss. Only this time, I wasn't the one holding the pieces. He looked at me, eyes filled with regret. "I thought money could fix everything. But it broke me, Mom. I'm so sorry." Tears filled my eyes. Not from anger, not from pain, but from something deeper. Acceptance. In that moment, I realized something profound. Sometimes, walking away isn't the end of love. It's the only way it can survive. 'Cause love without boundaries isn't love. Sacrifice disguised as devotion. And that night, as we sat there, mother and son, both broken, both human, I reached for his hand and said quietly, "It's not too late to start over. But this time, Michael, you start without my wallet. You start with your heart." He nodded, crying silently. And for the first time in years, I saw my son again. Not the man shaped by greed or fear, but the boy who once promised to build a home for us both. Michael stayed with me that night. Not as a son returning home, but as a man who finally understood what it meant to lose everything. He slept on the couch, quiet, humble, smaller than I remembered. And for the first time in years, I saw him without the armor of pride, without the desperate tone that always followed a request. Just, "Michael, my boy." The next morning, I woke up early, made coffee, and stood by the window watching the light crawl through the blinds. He used to love when I made pancakes on Sundays. He'd sit at the counter, feet dangling, watching me flip them with exaggerated excitement. So I did that again, without even thinking. And when he walked in, sleepy-eyed and slow, he smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. "Smells like home," he said. And in that small sentence, I felt something soften. We ate in silence. Every word we didn't say hung between us like ghosts. I wanted to ask about Emma, about the debt, about how far things had really gone. But I didn't. Not yet. 'Cause sometimes asking too soon makes the truth hide deeper. He broke the silence first. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Mom. I know I don't deserve it." I looked at him carefully. His hands were shaking slightly as he held his coffee mug. "I don't think forgiveness is about deserving," I said quietly. "It's about deciding when carrying the pain becomes heavier than letting it go." He nodded but didn't look up. Then, after a long pause, he whispered, "Emma's pregnant." My breath caught. Pregnant. The word echoed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. I didn't know what to feel. Joy? Fear? Anger? All of it at once. He continued. "She didn't tell me until after she left. Said she couldn't raise a child with someone who couldn't even face his own mother." I closed my eyes. The ache in my chest grew heavier. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was about to become someone's father. That night, after he fell asleep again, I sat at the table with a notebook. It was something I used to do when Michael was a child. Write him letters for moments he wasn't ready to understand yet. And now I did it again. I wrote, "Dear Michael, when you were little, you thought I was unbreakable. I let you believe that because every mother wants her child to feel safe. But the truth is, I broke many times, quietly, so you wouldn't hear. You thought I worked late because I loved my job. I didn't. I worked late because I didn't want you to grow up knowing what hunger felt like. And when you asked me to pay your wife's debt, I wasn't angry about the money. I was angry because you forgot who I really was. I was never your bank, Michael. I was your home. When I finished writing, I folded the paper and placed it in his bag. No signature. No note. Just silence on paper, the kind that says everything words can't. A week passed and I watched him try to rebuild. He found a part-time job at a repair shop. Came home tired but calm. Started eating properly again. There was still guilt in his eyes, but also a kind of quiet determination I hadn't seen in years. Then one evening, while we were watching TV, his phone buzzed. He looked at it for a long time before answering. "Emma?" I asked softly. He nodded. "She wants to talk." I turned down the volume and listened as his voice lowered. "I'm trying," he said. "I'm working now. I'm not asking Mom for anything. I just want to be better before the baby comes." There was a pause, then a small smile. "Yeah," he said. "She forgave me in her own way. I think I'm learning how to forgive myself now." I pretended not to hear the tears in his voice. 'Cause that was the moment I realized my silence, my absence, had taught him more than my presence ever could. Weeks turned into months. Spring came, and the flowers in my garden began to bloom again. Every petal felt like a quiet message from life itself. You can grow again, even after winter. One morning, a letter arrived, this time from Emma. Inside was a photo of a newborn baby, wrapped in a pale yellow blanket. Underneath, a short note. "Her name is Grace. We wanted you to know she has your eyes." I stared at that picture for a long time. My heart trembled, not from sadness this time, but from something deeper. Hope. I thought of how far we'd all come. The debt, the pain, the betrayal, none of it disappeared overnight. But it didn't define us anymore either. Later that evening, I called Michael. When he answered, I said only one thing. "I saw her. She's beautiful." He didn't speak right away. Then, softly, he whispered, "She's the best thing that ever happened to us, Mom." Us. That one word, it made everything worth it. 'Cause it meant we weren't broken anymore. We were learning to be whole again, even if the pieces didn't fit perfectly. A few days later, I visited them. Emma greeted me with tears in her eyes and a trembling smile. She handed me the baby, and the moment I felt that tiny heartbeat against my chest, something inside me healed. Grace looked up at me, innocent, curious, and I whispered, "You'll never know the weight of what came before you. Only the strength that built after." As the sun set outside their window, I realized the truth I'd been chasing all along. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about freeing yourself from being the keeper of someone else's mistakes. And when I walked away from my old life, I didn't lose my son. I found him again, not the boy who demanded, but the man who understood. Months later, Michael asked if he could name his repair shop after me. Called it May's Fix-It Garage. And every time I drove past and saw the small sign glinting in the afternoon sun, I smiled. 'Cause somehow, after all the breaking, all the leaving, and all the silence, we had all learned how to fix what mattered most. Strange how peace arrives quietly. Not in grand gestures or apologies, but in little moments that barely make a sound. A morning cup of tea, a soft breeze through the curtains, the sound of your son's laughter echoing from the phone. That was my life now. Quiet. Still. Whole again in a way I never thought possible. Michael and Emma were rebuilding their lives, and I had found comfort in mine. Every Sunday, I'd drive out to see baby Grace, her tiny fingers curling around mine as though she was trying to hold on to time itself. But life, it has a way of returning to unfinished business. Of testing the piece you've built just to see if it's real. It happened one Tuesday morning. The mail came as it always did, bills, a newsletter from the church, a few catalogs. And then, among them, a thick white envelope with no return address. The handwriting stopped me. Old-fashioned cursive. But I recognized it immediately. It was my late husband's. My hands trembled as I sat down, the letter resting on the kitchen table like something sacred. He had passed away almost 9 years ago. How could this be? I turned the envelope over and saw the seal of the law office we'd used years ago for our will. It wasn't a letter from the grave. It was something he'd left for me, something they'd only now decided to release. I opened it slowly, half afraid of what memories it might stir. Inside was a letter and a small brass key. Paper smelled faintly of cedar, just like his study used to. And his handwriting, still steady, confident, leapt off the page. My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means you've outlived my stubborn heart. I always knew you would. There's something I never told you. Not out of deceit, but out of protection. I wanted you to have peace when I no longer could. You'll find a small lockbox in the attic, behind the old trunk where we kept Michael's baby clothes. Use the key enclosed. Inside is something I didn't want our son to inherit too soon, something I trust only you to understand. With love, Robert. My heart raced as I finished reading. I looked at the brass key glinting in the sunlight. What could he have hidden all these years? I climbed the attic stairs carefully, the wooden boards creaking under each step. The air was thick with dust and time. It smelled like forgotten years, old books, baby blankets, a trace of his aftershave still lingering on the boxes he once packed himself. Behind the trunk, exactly where he said, was a small metal lockbox. I inserted the key and it turned with a soft click. Inside was an envelope, a single photograph, and a bank ledger. The photograph made me sit down instantly. It was Robert, younger, standing beside a woman I'd never seen before, and a boy. The boy looked to be about 6 or 7. My breath hitched. The boy looked like Michael. I stared at the picture for a long time, my mind trying to make sense of what my heart refused to believe. Then I opened the second envelope, hands trembling. Evelyn, before I met you, I made choices I was never proud of. The woman in the photograph was someone from my past. She passed away before I ever knew she had given birth. When the boy's aunt found me years later, I was already married to you. I couldn't tell you then, I didn't know how. I helped them quietly, supported the boy's education under another name. His name is Daniel. He's grown now. The account information you'll find below was meant for him, but I trust you to decide what's right. I only ask one thing: if you ever find him, tell him I did love him, even if I was too much of a coward to show it. Please forgive me, Evelyn. You are my true peace. I pressed the letter to my chest, and for the first time in years I cried. Not because I felt betrayed, but because I finally saw the man behind the silence. He had carried guilt I never knew existed. The same kind of quiet guilt I had seen in Michael. It was as though the men in my life had been cursed to carry their regrets in secret. I sat there for hours, staring at the photograph of the boy, Daniel, my husband's son, my son's half-brother. And then something strange happened. Instead of anger, I felt compassion. For the woman. For the child. Even for Robert. Because in the end, we're all just trying to protect someone we love, sometimes in ways that make no sense to the world. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the child's face, and I heard Robert's words again. Find him if you can. The next morning, I called the law office that had sent the letter. They confirmed it. Yes, Robert had set up a separate account under another name. Yes, the funds were still there. And yes, there was a note with the contact information of Daniel's guardian. I hesitated before writing it down. Part of me feared what I might uncover. Another part, the same stubborn part that had walked away from pain before, wanted to face this too. Because closure doesn't come from walking away. Sometimes it comes from walking straight into the storm you've avoided for years. A week later, I found him. Daniel. He was living in a quiet coastal town, running a small fishing shop. A simple life, humble, grounded. When I first saw him standing outside his store, his hair streaked with silver, I froze. He looked so much like Robert that I forgot how to breathe. I introduced myself simply. Told him my name. He looked at me curiously, polite but distant. Then I showed him the letter. He read in silence, and when he finished, tears welled in his eyes. He whispered, "I thought he forgot me." My voice broke. He never did. We sat together on the bench outside his shop, the ocean stretching endlessly in front of us. Two strangers bound by love, loss, and the man who had tried to protect them both in his own imperfect way. That night, as I drove home, the stars were unusually bright. And for a moment I swore I could hear Robert's voice again, calm, steady, familiar. "Thank you, Evelyn, for finding peace for both of us." I smiled through the tears. 'Cause maybe that's what life really is, one long journey toward forgiveness, not of others but of ourselves. When I returned home from meeting Daniel, the house felt different. Quieter, heavier, like it had overheard everything and was holding its breath with me. For days, I couldn't shake the image of his face. The way he smiled shyly when I said Robert's name. The way his voice trembled when he whispered, "I thought he forgot me." That sentence echoed in my chest long after the conversation ended. He hadn't asked for money. He hadn't even asked for answers. He just wanted to know if his father had ever remembered him. And somehow that broke me more than anything else. Because all those years, while I thought I'd been the only one carrying silent pain, there had been another, a boy, now a man, who had spent his entire life wondering why he wasn't enough to be claimed. That night, I sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where every turning point of my life seemed to begin. The letter from Robert lay beside the photograph, its corners soft from how many times I'd touched it. I thought about telling Michael. But how do you tell your only son that he isn't your husband's only son? Till secrets have a way of poisoning silence. And I had promised myself, no more secrets, not in this lifetime. So I called him. "Michael," I said softly, "I need you to come over. There's something I have to tell you." He could sense it in my tone. The worry, the weight. He arrived within the hour. He looked around the kitchen, at the open box on the counter, the letters, the old photograph. "What's all this, Mom?" I motioned for him to sit. My hands were trembling, but my voice stayed calm. "It's something your father left behind. Something he never had the courage to share." I slid the photograph toward him. He picked it up, studied it, and I watched his eyes shift from confusion to disbelief. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice small. "His name is Daniel," I said. "Your father's son from before me." The silence that followed was unbearable. I could almost hear his heart breaking. He stared at me, searching for denial, for a reason to think I was wrong. But when he saw the letter, his expression changed, from shock to something else. Something deeper. "He hid this," he whispered. "Yes," I said quietly. And I think it haunted him. Michael didn't speak for a long time. He just kept reading Robert's words over and over. Then finally he asked, "Does he know? The other son?" I nodded. "I met him." Michael looked up sharply. "You met him?" "He didn't know much either," I said. "He thought your father forgot him. But I told him the truth, that your father loved him, even if he didn't know how to show it." He stared at me, hurt, angry, confused, and I understood every emotion on his face. 'Cause it wasn't just about the secret. It was about realizing his father, the man he'd idolized, had lived a life far more complicated than he ever imagined. "Why would he hide it from us?" Michael asked finally. I sighed. "Because he wanted to protect us. Or maybe he just didn't know how to face the shame. People don't always hide things out of malice, Michael. Sometimes they hide them out of fear." For a long while, he said nothing. Then he looked at the picture again and murmured, "He looks like me." That was the moment everything shifted. It wasn't anger I saw in him anymore, it was empathy. That rare, fragile thing that only comes when your heart has been broken enough to understand someone else's pain. "Would you like to meet him?" I asked softly. He hesitated. Then, after a long silence, he said, "If you think it's right." A week later, we made the drive together. The sky was gray, heavy with rain. The kind of weather that makes the world feel smaller, as if it's holding you in place. Michael barely spoke. I could tell he was rehearsing in his head what he might say, or trying not to say anything at all. When we arrived, Daniel was standing outside his shop, just as he had been the day I met him. He looked surprised to see us both. "Daniel," I said gently, "this is my son, Michael." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel stepped forward, extended his hand, and said quietly, "I think we share more than we realized." Michael looked at him, then at me, and shook his hand. The simplicity of it nearly broke me. We sat by the harbor, the three of us. The air smelled of salt and rust, and seagulls circled overhead. Daniel told us about his life, how he'd grown up with his aunt, how he'd started his shop after years of working on boats. There was no resentment in his tone, just a quiet acceptance of what life had given him. Michael listened intently, his eyes softening with every word. Then he said something that made my throat tighten. "I think Dad would have been proud of you." Daniel smiled faintly. "I hope so." The two men sat there side by side, and I saw them not as strangers bound by blood, but as reflections of the same man, one who had made mistakes, yes, but had also loved in his own flawed human way. And somehow that realization felt like forgiveness, not just for Robert, but for all of us. When we said our goodbyes, Daniel handed me something. It was the photograph, the same one from the lockbox. "I think this belongs to you," he said. "You knew him better than either of us." I held it close, unable to speak. And as we drove away, I looked back through the window, watching him grow smaller in the distance, until the road curved and he was gone. That night, Michael sat at the table where everything had started. He looked at me and said quietly, "I used to think Dad's biggest mistake was keeping secrets. But maybe it was believing we couldn't forgive him." I nodded slowly. Sometimes, love doesn't look like what we expect. It's messy. It hides. But it's still love. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. And in that simple gesture, I realized my family wasn't broken anymore. It had just changed shape. Later that night, I went out to the porch. The moon hung low, the garden bathed in silver light. I whispered softly to the stars, "You were right, Robert." He turned out just fine. Both of them did. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. I felt surrounded by love that had survived distance, time, and silence. 'Cause love doesn't vanish. Just waits, sometimes for decades, until someone brave enough decides to open the letter. I still remember the morning I left that house for the last time. The one I had built, loved, cleaned, repaired, and prayed in. The one that had held the laughter of a young boy running down the hallway, asking for pancakes on Sunday mornings. I stood by the window one last time, sunlight brushing across the empty curtains, and I whispered to the walls, "You did your part. Thank you." Then I walked out, not in anger, not in bitterness. Just quiet resolve. The movers had come the day before. Most of the furniture was gone, the family portraits too. But I left one frame on the shelf, a picture of Robert holding baby Michael. It was the only one I couldn't bring myself to take. Because that version of him, of us, belonged there. And maybe someday Michael would see it and remember who we were before the world taught him to forget. I locked the door, left the keys on the counter, and stepped out into the morning air. I didn't know where I was going yet, only that it had to be far enough that his words couldn't echo back to me anymore. That was 3 years ago. And yet sometimes on quiet nights I still hear them, his voice breaking, saying, "She's my wife, Mom. I have to help her." After I left, I settled in a small town by the coast. A simple apartment above a bookstore run by a kind woman named Irene, who made tea that always tasted faintly of lavender. I'd never met her before that day, but when she asked, "Do you like quiet places?" I smiled and said, "It's all I want now." I began working there part-time, arranging books, dusting shelves, and recommending stories to travelers who passed through. It wasn't much, but it gave my days rhythm, something to hold on to. Every evening, I'd walk down to the pier and sit by the edge, letting the sound of the waves fill the silence that once held my son's laughter. I learned to live slower, to breathe again, to be someone without titles, not a mother, not a wife, not a caregiver. Just me. But one rainy evening, as I was closing up the shop, Irene came rushing in, holding her phone. "Mary," she said softly, "I think this might be your son." My heart stopped. She handed me the screen. It was a news article, a small local piece about a couple in financial trouble. Michael Reynolds, 34, and his wife Sarah are facing foreclosure after a failed investment left them with over $300,000 in debt. The photos showed them standing outside a courthouse, both looking older, worn down. Michael's eyes were empty, distant. I felt something break quietly inside me, like the soft snap of a branch in winter. Not anger. Not pity. Just sorrow. Because no matter how much time passes, a mother never stops hoping her child will find peace. And now I saw the price of choices made in blindness. 4 days after, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking of calling him, writing to him, something, anything. But then I remembered that last moment, the way he had looked at me, not as his mother, but as an obstacle. And I knew. I couldn't go back. Still, a small part of me couldn't ignore the feeling that maybe this was my chance to understand what life had been trying to show me all along. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic of my new home, I found something tucked away in the old box of Robert's letters. It was one I had never opened, sealed in a yellowed envelope marked, "For when you finally let go." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a note, written in his neat, gentle handwriting. "Mary, if you're reading this, it means you've done something brave, you've chosen yourself. I always worried you gave too much of your heart away, believing love was about sacrifice. But it's also about freedom. Remember, not every door that closes is a tragedy. Some are mercy in disguise." I read those words over and over again until tears blurred the ink. Robert had always known. He had always understood the quiet ache I carried, that need to be seen even when I was invisible. And in that moment I realized maybe leaving wasn't just walking away from them. Maybe it was walking toward the life he had always wanted me to have. A few weeks later, the phone rang. I almost didn't pick up, but something told me I should. "Mom." The voice was cracked, hesitant. Older. It was Michael. He sounded smaller than I remembered, like the world had finally stripped away his certainty. "I didn't know who else to call," he said. "Sarah left. Took everything. Even the car." There was a long silence between us. I could hear the sound of his breath on the other end, shaky, desperate. "I lost the house," he whispered. "I lost everything." I didn't say anything. 'Cause what could I say? He hadn't just lost things. He had lost the foundation he stood on. "Mom, I'm sorry. For everything." My heart tightened. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said. "I thought I was protecting her. But she used me. And when I couldn't give her more, she left." I closed my eyes. That moment was heavy, almost sacred. It wasn't about revenge or forgiveness. It was about truth finally settling between us, raw and undeniable. "Michael," I said quietly, "sometimes the hardest thing a person can do is learn what love isn't." He began to cry. And though I didn't reach through the phone, though I didn't rush to hold him, in that moment I forgave him. 'Cause the pain had already done what it needed to do. It had taught him what I couldn't. A few months later, I got a small envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name written in that familiar handwriting. Inside was a photograph of him standing by the ocean, looking healthier, calmer. On the back, he had written, "I'm trying to start again. I hope you're proud of me." I smiled. 'Cause I was. Not because he was perfect or redeemed or successful, but because he was finally human enough to start over. And that night, I took out Robert's letter again and placed it by the window, where the moonlight touched it gently. I whispered. You were right, Robert. It wasn't about holding on. It was about letting go. Life now feels different, quieter, but fuller in strange ways. I teach small art classes at the bookstore on weekends. Sometimes older women come to paint while they tell their stories, of children who forgot them, of husbands who left, of dreams that never came true. And every time I tell them one thing: you are still allowed to begin again. 'Cause we are. We are allowed to leave when love turns into obligation. We are allowed to choose peace over approval. We are allowed to stop being the ones who always forgive first. The world may call it selfish, but I've learned sometimes the kindest thing you can do for others is to finally take care of yourself. One evening, as I locked the bookstore door, Irene asked me, "Do you ever think of going back? To your old town?" I smiled softly. "No," I said. Everything that mattered found its way to me already. Then I walked down to the beach. The sky was streaked in gold and violet, the waves calm and endless. I sat there for a long time listening, and I realized something that made me smile through the tears. The ocean never apologizes for pulling the tide away. It just knows it'll always return when the time is right. Maybe that's what love really is. Not possession, not sacrifice, but knowing when to come back and when to let go. That night, for the first time in years, I slept peacefully. Not because I had won, but because I had finally forgiven both him and myself. And as I drifted off, I whispered one last prayer to the universe. Thank you for breaking me in all the right places. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks, so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.